Talk from Friday the 19th of February 2016, History of the Secret Space Program. Much of the data contained here is a summary of past disclosures, presented by Corey and David via their media outlets. But there are also hitherto unrevealed nuggets of information for those who have been following this unfolding story, several of which I think are of key importance. This is the most well-rounded presentation of the secret space program and history of the solar system that either of them has ever produced. It is an excellent place to start learning about what has apparently been happening under the cover of secrecy for eons. Here are some important points to consider. Full disclosure is the only option. As some know, there has been a debate between various alliances negotiating for the freedom of the planet. Some of these groups want full disclosure and a complete release of advanced technology to all people at the same time, whereas others want a limited or partial disclosure, drawn out over 100 years. David and Corey produced the following presentation in an effort to blow the lid off of the partial disclosure agenda. The data presented below is in harmony with a full disclosure effort, which if it is shared virally, could make the partial disclosure agenda impossible to realize. David and Corey are making every effort to ensure full disclosure takes place, encouraging a grassroots effort from within the awakening community. If you are reading these words, you are part of this grassroots effort. Solar shift could be delayed. In David's Saturday talk, he mentioned that the Sphere Being Alliance has been holding back the energetic ascension of the solar system to provide humanity more time to heal themselves and regain their freedoms, one of the well-known aspects of Corey's testimony. This is being made possible by thousands of massive spheres, cloaked throughout the solar system, here to dampen galactic energy waves which will one day cause a grand solar shift. Recently, Earth-based alliances have chosen to move forward with a partial disclosure agenda, one that will drag the whole process out over 100 years, as mentioned earlier. In a shocking revelation, the Sphere Beings recently said that if a grassroots full disclosure effort is not successful in uniting the awakening community to demand the whole truth, then the Sphere Beings will hold back the energetic shift for an age. David speculated that this delay could be at least 100 years, or that it could be as long as 700, referencing a passage from the Law of One. To be clear, partial disclosure is not what the SSP Alliance or the Sphere Being Alliance want. And again, David and Corey are doing everything they can to stop this effort and ensure full disclosure takes place. This talk is part of that effort. The current state of affairs. I was personally taken aback by the notion the Sphere Beings would actually allow the partial disclosure plan to go through. But after some quiet contemplation, I realized that these beings are highly conscious of the laws of the universe, chiefly, free will, and that they cannot avoid humanity's choice, no matter how much they might want to. The Sphere Beings have suggested in the past that full disclosure is the best option to give humanity a real chance at true freedom and prosperity. But the thing that has always held us back, now and in the deep past, is a consciousness of separation, hence their message of love, forgiveness, and raising of our vibrations. The reality is, the truther or awakening community is heavily divided, rendered almost completely ineffective insofar as realizing meaningful change for the planet. We've allowed ourselves to focus on our differences instead of the common ground we each share. This is no surprise, as there are countless social programs of subliminal influencing, not to mention personality parasites that compel us to choose fear over love, hate over compassion, and half-truths over the whole truth. The good news is, the truth can be obscured, but never destroyed. We are already one people, we are already a global family, we are already powerful co-creators able to effect great change. We can deny the realities of interconnectedness, but they continue to exist, and we continue to share the burden of this world as one people. We just have to acknowledge these truths and then ask ourselves, what are we actually creating with our choices? What are we choosing to focus on and breathe life into via our consciousness? Are we focusing on truth, cooperation, and love? These are the questions we each must face as we walk our path in life. Generally speaking, as individuals in the truther community, we've been trained through elaborate infiltration efforts, to attack, with prejudice, any point of view that doesn't agree with our own. In many cases, we agree that the cabal must be stopped, that food is being poisoned, that the environment is being destroyed, and that something needs to change, yet because of one divergent belief or another, one disagreement or another, no lasting cooperation can be realized. I've even seen some fight over what words are used to describe our current predicament, with some claiming we've been enslaved by evil humans, while others say it was the Archons. And these small differences prevents otherwise cooperative people from working together for change. Oh, how powerfully we've been duped into choosing separation, fear, and disempowerment. What can we do? What I think we could benefit from is to practice open-mindedness and respect the fact that our knowledge is limited, that we don't know everything. Our fellows have a different point of view that can provide us insights into the truth, into who we are and what our purpose in life is, but only if we receive what is offered with childlike innocence. An open mind and heart, combined with an honest appraisal of oneself, helps us keep our reality bubbles permeable, as Corey has mentioned before. While I think unity is essential right now, absolute unity is not a realistic goal. Initially, we'll need to find a way to agree to disagree on any topic that would otherwise prevent cooperation. But common goals are what we can base a foundation of unity on, those being, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the desire for clean food and water, the desire for a sustainable society, free of toxic pollution, a world free of slavery and oppression, and so on. I think that all our seeming differences are an illusory slick atop an ocean of unacknowledged commonalities. In addition, we've been indoctrinated to believe we are fundamentally separate from each other, the universe and even the Creator, all founded on false perspectives of reality. The only way for us to stay divided, to continue to see the world as separate, is if we focus on our differences, if we focus on untruth, instead of the seemingly infinite reasons to focus on what unites us. Often what holds us back is fear that what matters to us won't be acknowledged by another, that they won't care about what we do. And for those lost in separate self-consciousness, this may be true. In many cases, when we see that others believe something that we do not, we immediately feel a barrier go up between us, and then through our choices we reinforce that feeling. But when we bravely pour out kindness and compassion from within, healing is radiated without, helping to create a space for cooperation. I think learning to develop the ability to listen to others compassionately, entertaining their ideas and beliefs, without feeling the need to defend our own, again with childlike innocence, is essential right now. In this way, a loving, cooperative, and accepting relationship can be developed, one that will allow us to share our most cherished ideas free of defensive reactions that maintain separation. It is fear, lack of empathy and close-mindedness that has kept humanity divided over the eons, therefore, only love, forgiveness and truth can restore universal consciousness. I, for one, am not satisfied to wait 100 years for what we could have right now. If the awakening community truly is the linchpin for making full disclosure a reality, then let's stop the infighting, set aside our differences, and make steps towards a brighter future, together, as one people. It's so simple a child can see the wisdom of it. And perhaps it is a childlike point of view we need most right now to navigate this transitional age successfully. This is a stillness in the storm creation. Please share widely. Other information. Note: the images David used throughout the talk were not captured via screenshot. All the images below were found online or provided courtesy of Gaia.com. In some cases, I was also able to find the images David used online. Much of the information presented in this talk is also available in Cosmic Disclosure. Summarized notes will be in black, with additional information, or my commentary, in green bolded brackets. I also added additional data points provided from other talks by David and Corey in the past. I did not offer much commentary below, for ease of absorbing the overall narrative. More in-depth analysis of this material can be found embedded within the Summary and Analysis of Cosmic Disclosure series, available here. To support Corey and David's work, Subscribe to Gaia TV via blueavians.com. David Wilcock's website is divinecosmos.com. Here are David's 3 series on Gaia.com. His new book, The Ascension Mysteries, is now available for pre-order. Corey Good's website is sbherebeingalliance.com. Here is Corey's series on Gaia.com.
Now on to the Expo session's detailed notes. Source: Conscious Life Expo. Introductions. Host introduces David and Corey. David talks about the huge demand for this talk, and that it will help ensure a full disclosure narrative comes about. David reviews his history, books, and experience. David talks about a quantum leap in evolution, as covered by his work on wisdom teachings and his website divinecosmos.com. David says Corey got pulled into this unfolding story, back in 2015, which he will cover later. David refers to the many massive spheres that have entered the solar system, some the size of Jupiter and Neptune, controlled by a benevolent group of beings known as the Sphere Being Alliance. More on this later. David mentions this time in history is all about a grand consciousness evolution. Refers to his books as evidence. David mentions cosmic disclosure on Gaia.com, where much of Corey's testimony is available. David says space and time is an emanation of a geometry. Davide says 20% of stars like our Sun have Earth-like planets around them. David mentions that DNA is a natural emanation of the laws of quantum mechanics. The universe behaves like sacred geometry, began with a vibration, and is teeming with life.
What is the secret space program? David mentions there is a group that is out there in our solar system, right now, which is colonizing space. And this group is run by people on Earth. This group has already done what seems impossible, like in movies such as Star Trek and Star Wars. Portal travel, faster than light travel, is all possible and a well-established reality, that has been kept hidden. David says all those who are seeking the truth are essential players in breaking down the walls of secrecy. Crowd goes wild. David says what we're talking about here is a secret space program, SSP, that has been kept hidden from the public. But a program that was paid for by the public. When you look at the Apollo moon missions, the Vietnam War, etc., it was all money laundering to fund these programs. He asks Corey how many trillions of dollars were spent on the SSP. Corey says the lower-level secret space program is funded from money laundering operations on Earth, but the higher-level programs are self-funded via their own trading platforms with other groups and ET races. These higher-level groups would be called breakaway civilizations because they are no longer dependent on society to achieve their goals. David says during the crash at Roswell, New Mexico in 1947 the government grabbed technology and reverse-engineered it, but kept it secret so it can be exploited by this hidden group. But one person broke through the ranks and is spilling the beans, as an insider and whistleblower, that's Corey. David mentions Gaia.com is hiring to help deliver the truth to the people. Lists a bunch of different jobs saying to go to joinaia.com for more information. The fall of the outer barrier. David says there are ancient ruins in the solar system that are probably 2.6 billion years old. During that time, Earth was swampy, hot, and not too pleasant to live on. But there was a beautiful paradise, called Tiamat, a super-Earth that used to orbit where the asteroid belt is now. The ancient builder race is a group of highly advanced beings from our solar system's deep past. Ruins of this civilization are found everywhere in the solar system, and in many cases, the technology added a beneficial effect for life there, such as the Great Pyramids of Egypt. In a recent meeting with Inner Earth groups from January of this year, Corey discovered that the ancient builder race and the sphere beings are actually one and the same. The Inner Earth peoples have long revered the ancient builder race, who they call the Guardians. The sphere beings have returned to help all life in the solar system prepare for a huge evolutionary shift, made possible via galactic energy waves that have been bathing the solar system for years. These energies will continue to build up until a quantum leap occurs, dramatically altering life as we know it. But in an effort to ensure all beings have a chance to grow through this shift, Massive spheres are here to dampen the energy. David mentions how most of his insiders' intel has never been publicly released, as a method of vetting out new insiders. When he met Corey in 2009, he was able to tell David data that he never released publicly, which he believes verifies Corey's authenticity. David mentions how one of Richard C. Hoagland's top insiders told David that they used a highly advanced computer program called Brilliant Pebbles that enabled them to model every object in the solar system to such a degree that they could rewind time using computer models, showing that a super-Earth-sized planet was destroyed about 500,000 years ago. David adds that Corey knew the name of the program and many other aspects of Brilliant Pebbles, again vetting Corey as authentic. David says the story begins on the super-Earth, Tiamat, that was destroyed long ago. The planet had oceans, breathable atmosphere, and several moons. One of them was Mars, which was also a viable sphere for habitation. Apparently the peoples who lived on Tiamat and Mars were warring with each other. David asks Corey how often one would encounter watery moons orbiting planets outside of the solar system. Corey says you can find these moons around gas giants and super-Earth-type planets fairly regularly. David mentions that the destruction of Tiamat destroyed two highly advanced civilizations, one on Tiamat and one on Mars. David mentions a protection grid was active around the solar system before this event and asks Corey to confirm. Corey says that he was told by the priestess Kari, from his Inner Earth meeting that took place in September 2015, these warring factions gained access to some of the ancient build race technology from these ruins left everywhere in the solar system. Part of what they accessed was the security grid or force field, the energy barrier, that was protecting the solar system, left in place by the ancient builder race before they left our frequency. These two warring groups attempted to use the technology for their own ends, causing a major cataclysm in the process, which not only disturbed the whole solar system, but also brought down this energetic barrier left by the ancient build race. This barrier had heretofore protected the solar system from less benevolent races. David mentions that in tomorrow night's talk, he will show slides of moons that, he believes, are ancient outposts and bases from this period. He also covers this material in his show Wisdom Teachings. David mentions that these moons look just like the Death Star, from the film Star Wars, which were capable of firing particle beam weapons. Mimas moon of Saturn on left, Death Star from Star Wars on right. David says before event occurred, it was like the Garden of Eden in our solar system. David mentions that after this protective barrier went down, service to self groups came in, which the Inner Earth people refer to as genetic farmer groups or races. He says that the Draco came into the solar system after this barrier went down, and that Corey originally leaked a time frame of 370,000 years ago for when this occurred. The fall of the outer barrier was a major milestone in the history of the solar system, shaping Earth's unfolding drama in the process. It was after this point that the Earth became the setting for several genetic, social, and spiritual experiments by groups who did not always have benevolent intentions. The Draco Alliance. Corey says the Draco Alliance is made up of a central reptilian group, but also an insectoid race, and some other engineered races, engineered presumably by the Draco, hence their name genetic farmer groups. David says, this group of reptilian humanoids, became highly advanced but they are very negative, going around the galaxy looking for other groups to twist into their agenda. As an aside, one of the bigger secrets is that the universe is designed to make humanoid life forms, so they are found everywhere. Corey has confirmed in Cosmic Disclosure that there are humanoid races of every conceivable type in the cosmos, each evolving from an animal species on their home world. But what these Draco do is find other reptilian-type humans, that evolved naturally in their own neighborhoods. The Draco then intermingle their DNA into other reptilians they find, and eventually have them join the Draco Alliance. Presumably this process is not something that is mutually agreed upon, as in done under duress or via manipulation. Corey says, the reptilian recruits, so to speak, have similar behavior and commonalities to with their Draco recruiters, helping to facilitate an alliance. David mentions the movie Jupiter Ascending, which is jam-packed with solar system history, the agenda of the Draco group, using humans as a food resource, and their use of human beings for life extension technology, DNA hybridization programs. Corey and David saw the movie together during last year's Consciousness Life Expo. Corey's frickin' mind was blown by what was revealed in the film. David shows slide of a reptilian from the movie, saying that this might have been the reason why Corey was so shocked. Screen capture of the movie Jupiter Ascending, showing reptilian. David says these are the genetic farmers who appear to be in control of the show. But they are working with humans. Corey says it wasn't an accurate representation of a Draco, but the relationships shown in the movie were very interesting. David suggests that what is depicted in the movie is part of some soft or partial disclosure effort. Corey says that he thinks the disclosure in the movie is higher than the secret space program, that it has to do with these 22 genetic, social, and spiritual experiments being conducted on Earth by a super federation of extraterrestrials who have lived within our solar system since the time this outer barrier came down. The movie could be their version of the history, from the people behind these 22 programs. Corey has mentioned in the past that there are up to 60 ET groups that maintain permanent outposts to monitor experiments that are actively being conducted on the Earth. Apparently these groups came in after the fall of the outer barrier and many of them have bases on the moon. David shows image of a white royal Draco. The Draco Alliance is made up of many different castes and races, some that are warriors whereas others are the ruling elite, like what is presented below. White Royal Draco. David mentions that the wings are wrong, based on what Corey has said. This was the closest image Corey was able to find online. David says Corey had to meet this Royal Draco during a meeting, and it was not pleasant. These white Royal Dracos were pleading for clemency at a meeting Corey attended in mid-2015, as a result of the outer barrier going back up after the Cabal attempted to destroy one of the moon-sized spheres close to the Earth using a particle beam weapon that was partially located in Pine Gap, Australia. They discuss this in detail in Season 2 Episode 16 of Cosmic Disclosure and further along in this talk. Reactivation of the outer barrier trapped many groups in the solar system that were planning to leave before the solar shift took place. As a result, tenuous alliances that have been in place for thousands of years disintegrated when the White Royal Draco told the SSP Alliance that they would sell out the entire Cabal pyramid below them in exchange for passage out of the solar system. When this offer was made, key figures in the Cabal were present. Since that time, a tremendous amount of Cabal infighting has been taking place, as their once well-organized group crumbles into separate factions with competing agendas. David mentions that the meta-message for this talk is that there are demonic presences, that we could think of as these reptilians, but they are not as powerful as the good guys. These guys, the Draco, are actually using the Earth as a fear factory, consuming what they call Lushi. They need humanity to be in fear, stressed out, hating life etc., and work with the ground-based Cabal to ensure those conditions are maintained, hence false flags attacks, denatured food, the war on terror, etc. In the below-linked articles, I attempt to discuss the scientific basis for fear food or Lushi and why races that use artificial life extension technology needed to survive. Related David Wilcock, Stargates, Consciousness Tech, Draco Fear Food and Methods of Personal Transformation, ET Contacts Analysis of Fade to Black May 26, 2015. Related Organic versus Artificial Immortality Cyborg ET Races, AI Black Goo, Wave X, The Solar Shift and Organic Evolution via Truth Receptivity. David mentions that one of his insiders said that if people were smiling, happy, and felt joy for even one day, it would be enough to defeat the entire Draco Alliance, who are totally dependent on Lushi for survival. Corey says, yes, that Rotiriir, the blue avian who is a member of one of the 5 sphere-being races that operates the thousands of massive spheres in the solar system right now, said that once we get to a high enough energetic point, all these etheric parasites and entity attachments, will go back into the outer realms from whence they came. and that people will be going through a type of energetic withdrawal, like someone detoxing from a major drug addiction, because these parasites do provide some emotional stability to their hosts, which then become dependent on them. David mentions there are ways to scientifically prove this. He talks about an experiment where fish eggs at different rates of development are kept close to each other, so they can exchange biophotons. The older eggs actually draw health out of the younger ones, so long as light can flow between them, and the younger eggs wither and die as a result. This can't be explained using normal science, one needs to talk about energetics. Eventually one realizes there is a law in the universe that actually allows for an advisory, even though the universe is benevolent and loving. The universe allows evil to exist to inspire spiritual growth, and help us come together, to form unity against the adversary. This is a rather controversial topic, but it is supported by experience and codified as divine or natural law. Simply put, when we observe harm, hardship, or suffering of others, it is an opportunity from the universe to actually become an embodiment of love, healing and forgiveness. In this way, each individual is given a chance to gain wisdom by experiencing the transcendence of hardship. The principle of causality describes how all causes are sourced from mind via free will, with their effects being balanced by cosmic law. This means that free will is the first cause of, not only truth, love, and freedom, but also falseness, hate, and slavery. We are so creatively empowered to participate in the process of spiritualization via our free will endowment from the Creator, which also means those on the front lines of the shift are the most empowered to effect change. For more on this, see the below linked article. Related, the natural law basis of harvest, the spiritual evolution of Gaia and all who dwell in the system of soul. David says, these guys, the Draco, came into our solar system, splicing their DNA with ours. We have all sorts of genetic anomalies as a result. See Lloyd Pye's presentation for more on this. One of those anomalies is the appendix, which apparently one of his insiders told him, used to be an organ system that would take nutrition from your liver and reintroduce it into the small intestine, processing it twice, allowing someone to live for 900 years. So they, the Draco presumably, clipped it out. They tried to get rid of the pineal gland too, but that got put back in. He asked Corey for confirmation, which Corey says he has heard of as well. I just wrote an article covering evidence from recent genetic testing that suggests the human race had multiple genetic contributors, one major one about 15,000 years ago. Related, otherworldly lineage of a human species with amnesia, myths and legends, Rh negative factor, genetic atom, and our alien DNA. David says the objective for us, today, is to determine how do we recognize that these beings are not all powerful demons, that can't be dealt with. They are in the sandbox along with humanity, all for cosmic growth. There was an Edgar Cayce reading, in a room with 35 people, and the entity who was contacted via the mediumship said, "You have enough people in this room to end World War II right now." The answer is pure consciousness. There will be a pure consciousness exercises at the end of the talk, a guided meditation. David says the purity of our hearts, the consciousness of the universe, will bring us one step closer to freedom. Audience cheers. David mentions there are 274 slides. Corey says many haven't been seen before, including footage of helicopters flying over his house. Other reptilians. David starts to show reptilian images. David says to Corey that some of these beings have tannish skin and others have green scales. Corey says some of them are often confused with greys. David adds, but not all greys are reptilians. The above image is one that is short, about 4 to 5 feet tall. Corey says they have tiny razor-sharp teeth. David shows a black reptoid found within the inner earth, saying it is 8 feet tall. David says these guys aren't fun, they could eat you. David asks Corey how big the white royal Draco from earlier is. Corey says they are 14 feet tall. David adds that their shoulders are 5 feet wide and they weigh over 3,000 pounds. David talks about providing scientific data. introducing the commonly known narrative of these genetic farmer reptilians as they are described by Zecharia Sitchin. Analysis of Zecharia Sitchin's work. David mentions that it appears Sitchin made a lot of mistakes, but that is a long discussion for another time. Here is an article discussing the perspective that Sitchin's material was wrong and possible implications. The gist of his story was that these giant beings, calling themselves the Anunnaki, came to Earth, splicing in their genetic material with the existing human population. Enlil, the bad guy, and Enki, the good guy, are Anunnaki figures in this story. Apparently, Enki desterilized the newly formed human race, so it could procreate, which happened 250,000 years ago. This is the common, Sitchin, Anunnaki story. David adds that less than a year ago, mainstream media released a story about the genetic Adam and Eve. Study shows humans are evolving faster than previously thought. Every single male on Earth can trace their lineage to a single man 250,000 years ago, which just so happens to fit what Sitchin said. The article says that the oldest known male ancestor was around at the same time as the oldest known female, mitochondrial Eve. So one DNA study traces back to genetic Adam, and one traces back to genetic Eve, which just so happened to have existed on Earth at the same time, and just so happened to fit the timeline provided by Sitchin. In Season 3, Episode 6 of Cosmic Disclosure, David and Corey discuss how Sitchin's alleged translations cannot be verified by comparing them to the Sumerian cuneiform tablets. Apparently, Sitchin was fed a narrative by agents who were looking to disclose a part of the truth mixed with disinformation. David asked Corey about the article discussing the genetic Adam and Eve being a partial disclosure effort, to which Corey agreed, saying, "They have been laying this partial disclosure narrative out for a while, but recently it has picked up in pace." David says that the whole reason for their talk tonight is to release intel that the people behind the partial disclosure effort don't want to come out. David and Corey want full disclosure, as they've both said many times. This is one of the reasons why I produced this summary, to ensure the data would be able to be spread far and wide in an effort to derail this partial disclosure agenda. David asks Corey if the Sitchin narrative, which David just reviewed, is part of the partial disclosure they plan rolling out now. Corey says yes, that they have been rolling out Sitchin's narrative since at least the 1970s. David asks Corey if he thinks Sitchin was a part of this plan, to which Corey says yes, according to the information he was provided. David says that Corey did his own due diligence on Sitchin's translations, and they didn't match up with what the scholars were saying. Corey isn't saying that all the data Sitchin provided was bad information, just that it came from higher-ups through a narrative, and as truth seekers we should try and verify it personally. Corey says he investigated the Sumerian references on his own, no one told him to do this. David mentions that the cuneiform tablets are made with a cylindrical stylus, rolled into clay and then deciphered using the Rosetta Stone, allowing us to read the Sumerian language to a certain extent. The Cabal created this narrative, through Sitchin, that has truth to it, and that they want the people to know. Again, most likely this aspect of the Cabal's plan was to seed a narrative into the consciousness of humanity that would eventually become accepted historical fact, which is one way to manipulate humanity for their agenda. The Cabal wants us to think the Anunnaki created humanity, because within this story, they are descendants from the first humans. This is where the idea of the divine right to rule came from. It also fits into the transhumanist agenda by suggesting the human race is an accident, and the only hope for our continued evolution is by merging with machines. Refugee relocation to Earth and entry of the Super Federation groups. David says these people who were on Mars and Tiamat were moved to the Earth during this time, asks Corey for confirmation. Corey says yes, this happened in a type of refugee relocation program, by some of the groups in the Super Federation. The group that did this was not the Draco, as the timeline of this event was before they arrived some 370,000 years ago. The Super Federation was responsible for relocating the survivors to Earth. David asks how many ET races are in the Super Federation. Corey says 40 to 60 groups are present at any given Super Federation meeting. David says when the protective grid around the solar system dropped, about 500,000 years ago, these Super Federation groups came in and started tinkering around. They also knew the destruction of Tiamat was going to happen, so instead of stopping it, they helped move people to Earth before its destruction. David also discusses this history in much greater detail in his show Wisdom Teachings. Shem, from Discerning the Mystery, has been doing analyses of those shows as well. Corey confirms, they transferred the people over as refugees. David mentions all the content on Gaia.com and that if people use BlueAvians.com, David and Corey will get credit for those subscriptions to help fund their work. David reiterates that the genetic farmers brought people to Earth, and then civilizations rose and fell over and over again. Atlantis was only one of the more recent of these civilizations. Corey says that the smart glass pad said this was happening for eons, civilizations were rising and falling. Smart glass pads are iPad-like devices that were supplied to SSP personnel for briefing purposes. Corey describes the smart glass pads saying they have main articles and then reference links or footnote information at the bottom that came from each group that provided data for the article. In this footnote section, different groups discuss their interpretations of the data in greater detail. Corey mainly reviewed just the general articles, and not the reference information, as he is not a scientist. The footnotes were from different syndicates that put their own spin on the data in the main article. David says that Corey had access to these pads when he was in the program. Most of the historical data he references comes from these pads. David begins to discuss a dialogue between Plato and Solon, from antiquity, wherein Solon is asking questions of the mystery schools of the Egyptian priesthood. David digresses to ask Corey if he thinks the priesthood in Egypt had access to these deeper secrets and history. Corey responds by saying usually the priesthood of many civilizations guarded this information from the kings and the common people, using it to manipulate the ignorant population. I'll add here that the basis of our current system of control is the occultation of knowledge, hiding it from the people to gain an advantage over them. This is why full disclosure is essential to providing humanity a real opportunity for co-creative harmony or a society based on truth, love, and freedom. David asks why they didn't want people to know. Corey says because knowledge is power. The whole matrix of control, all the efforts of the cabal to manipulate humanity, can only work if ignorance is widespread. A people that know who they are, where they come from, and what their ultimate relationship to the universe is would never be so easily manipulated, hence hiding truth and getting us to believe in falsehoods are essential to their plans. The word occult essentially means hidden knowledge, and the dark occultists of this world, known by many names, base all their plans on the ignorance of humanity at large. Therefore, re-education of humanity is essential to re-establishing common trust and restoring freedom, as well as arresting any plans of partial disclosure. The rise and fall of civilizations. David continues on with introducing the dialogue between Solon and the Egyptian priesthood. Apparently, Plato published what was said, which got him into a lot of trouble. He wasn't supposed to leak this information. Here is the quote of this dialogue that David reads from. As for those genealogies of yours which you just now recounted to us, Solon, they are no better than the tales of children. In the first place you remember a single deluge only, but there were many previous ones. In the next place, you do not know that there formerly dwelt in your land the fairest and noblest race of men which ever lived, and that you and your whole city are descended from a small seed or remnant of them which survived. And this was unknown to you, because, for many generations, the survivors of that destruction died, leaving no written word. Source. David mentions the Cuban Atlantis, saying, Linda Moulton Howe covered this story when it was breaking, shortly after the infamous 9/11 event in 2001. David says his mind was blown when he saw the headline from BBC News: Lost City found beneath Cuban waters. In water half a mile deep they find ruins of a lost city. David asks the audience how far back in time we need to go for sea level to be low enough for the city to be on dry land. The answer is 12,000 years ago, approximately the same time as other deluges, spoken of in myths, sacred texts, and historical accounts. David says Paulina Zelitsky was the oceanographer who broke the story. She was contracted by the Cuban government to take sonar readings of the ocean floor, looking for sunken gold. But instead of gold, she found structures that were highly artificial. He goes over some sonar images of the area. David shows a 3D image produced via sonar readings. 3D rendering of site near Cuba. David says Paulina made the mistake of signing an exclusive contract with National Geographic, who never published the story. David believes the story was suppressed. He says, the above 3D rendering was leaked out, despite the cover-up. David mentions the differences between these pyramids and the smooth-faced Egyptians ones. David goes back to the dialogue between the Egyptian priest and Solon, saying Egyptians were very knowledgeable and had highly advanced technology. That society collapsed, but they left their secrets which were found and held by the priest class of ancient cultures, kept alive over time by secret societies. Early history of the Cabal. David begins to talk about the rise of the Cabal via Sumer and the Roman Empire. Sumer is where the inner earth peoples reconnected with the survivors of one of these latter-day deluges, appearing to them as gods and offering support to help restart civilization. The Sumerian civilization is an anomaly because it does not fit the slow progression theory proposed by mainstream archaeologists. The Sumerian civilization sprang up out of nowhere, complete with a financial system, civil law, advanced farming techniques, and profound knowledge of the stars. Given these oddities, the more likely explanation is that the civilization was kick-started via some external influencing agency. Corey says there is a confusion about this time period, adding that the inner earth peoples were making contact with the surface population in the area of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Fertile Crescent. He also says there were contacts from the genetic farmer groups as well, the Super Federation. It's hard to tell which group had the most influence on the development of the Sumerian culture. David adds that we do know many of these occult secret societies trace themselves back to the times of Sumer and Babylon. Mark Pacio and Jay Parker are whistleblowers who were once involved with Satanism and lower-level operatives in the Cabal. Parker says he was raised in a generational satanic family. His father claimed to be an Atlantean warlock. Parker's mother would often tell him that their order of the Illuminati traces its origins to the times of Babylon and before, revering the black sun and worshipping dark gods. David says from there, it splashed into Egypt and the pharaonic dynasties. Further, a great deal of secret knowledge was stored in the Library of Alexandria that burned in a false flag-style event after the Romans conquered Egypt, moving all the documents to Rome, now held in the Vatican Library. Corey adds that they actually burned census documents, tax records, and the like, but nothing of importance. David says that all the history is still stored in the Vatican, such as the refugee transfer records, and lineages tracing back to before the relocation to the earth. Corey says the elite had access to knowledge and stored it in the Vatican, and that some of the data in the smart glass pads came from records there. David begins to talk about how the Romans invaded Great Britain in 55 BC under the command of Julius Caesar. After the Romans arrived, all the Celtic history was wiped out. No historical accounts were left in the mainstream from this period. He mentions covered-up history about Stonehenge and the ley lines it is connected to. Corey adds the Celts must have had knowledge of natural stargates or portals in the solar system, and that in the Common Era we had no knowledge of these energetic grids of the Earth because it was wiped from history by the Roman cult or Cabal. Stargates and portals. David goes on to say that these stone rings and megalithic sites are built on ley lines. It even shows up in the Da Vinci Code, where they are talk about Rosslyn or Roseline Chapel. They were disclosing the energy grid in that book. They were talking about sites where you can do rituals or ceremonies and actually open up stargates or portals. David asks Corey about what he heard in the smart glass pads about portals that will open up on Earth at certain times and places that one could use to travel through space and time. Corey says he didn't hear about that from the glass pads. It was intuitive empaths, in the secret space program, that would be used to triangulate where and when these portals would open up, which would either be underground or water, at the surface, or above it. They seemed to open up randomly at first, but after they got the celestial mechanics down, they realized that depending on the positions of celestial bodies, such as the sun, moon, planets, other stars, etc., these portals would open. Related Cosmic Disclosure Episode 14, Portals, Parallel Earth, Summary and Analysis Corey Goode and David Wilcock. Related Cosmic Disclosure Episode 12, Portals, Cosmic Web, Summary and Analysis Corey Goode and David Wilcock. David asks Corey to recount a story about South American priests during the time the Spanish conquistadors were conquering the area. Corey says that on the smart glass pads he read about an account discussing a Spanish raid wherein they were chasing an indigenous priest carrying gold. The priest walked up to the side of a wall, touching it in a couple of places, and moments later the priest walked right through the wall as if nothing was there. This was witnessed by the Spanish conquistadors, who then sent reports back. David says the point is that there is physics that is not understood in the mainstream. The Russians have done experiments which show that electromagnetic energy can be changed into gravitational energy. Dan Winter describes the force of gravity as the recursive addition of waves of charge, which sounds very similar to what David just described. The Russians break it down as electromagnetic gravity spin. It's that spin portion of gravity that the Russians call torsion fields, which are just fields that have a self-organized vortex geometry or spin. This is the secret to health and longevity. That's what the pyramid shape does, that's what stone circles are doing. David says he just did a whole bunch of episodes on Gaia.com about this. The Russians have done pyramid studies that show they can cure diabetes, restore premature babies back to totally normal health, produce ozone, clean the air, reduce seismic activity, and so on, proven by over 39 different pyramids that have been built all over Russia and the Ukraine. They only used fiberglass, PVC, and concrete. Imagine what could be done with a stone like granite, which is a crystal oscillator. These are very powerful technologies, that's why you see them all over the world, in Australia, South America, Egypt, and so on. Related Russian scientists build and study pyramids. What they found could change the world. David says that pyramids are a type of magnet for these energy fields. The shape and the material are the magnet in this case, which attract these energy fields. In my own studies, what makes pyramids work this way is that they act like a satellite dish does, focusing latent energy already in the environment to a point that can be used for various functions via an entrainment or synchronization process. Time travel and timeline jumping. David says that there are these bubbles of electromagnetic energy that come up from the center of the Earth, forming gravity. If you happen to be standing in one when it came to the surface, it would open up a portal and transport you off somewhere in space or time. David mentions how this technology is not something the elite want us to know about because they have been using it. One of his insiders said one of the mental disciplines in the Cabal is called time travel. Corey says he stayed away from the time travel programs he was close to in the SSP. David says that in the time travel discipline, they would go to sacred sites, like Stonehenge, and push themselves into an out-of-body state. While out of body they would then travel back in time using the natural portal there, and upon arrival in this new time, look for a bum or homeless person, essentially someone with a weak sense of free will. Using the spiritual disciplines learned in the order, they would take over the bum's body using their disembodied consciousness. Employing this technique, they can use the other person's body like a puppet for various ends, such as committing murder or a crime in an effort to alter the present for themselves, which would actually happen. The adepts could actually change their timeline by altering the past, traveling through a portal as a disembodied consciousness and using another person's body as an instrument. Afterward, the only one who could remember the previous timeline is the adept who went out of body. David makes a comparison between this anecdote and the Matrix films, wherein the agents can take over someone's body in the Matrix, especially those with a suppressed free will. David also mentions the latest X-Men movie, Apocalypse, is all about Wolverine being kept in stasis, showing the other X-Men in the past. David mentions the whistleblower Svali who came forward about these techniques as well. David asks Corey if it is possible that you can go out of body and use these stone rings to travel back in time and alter the present. The book series and TV show Outlander is based on this stone ring time travel phenomenon. Corey says it is possible, and that in doing so, some of these groups were creating a lot of temporal anomalies, and then trying to go back trying to fix things but making ever bigger messes in the process. Eventually, an ET group told them that time, like space, is elastic, and things would fix themselves if they just stopped messing with time. David asks Corey if members of the Cabal were using this technique to try and alter the timeline to change key events in history, for their favor. Corey says yes. David asks how often he thinks this was happening. Corey says it wasn't happening all the time, and that they weren't always trying to change events. Most times they were just going back to observe or do reconnaissance. David reiterates that it was for spying, gathering intelligence or anticipating moves before they happen. You don't need technology to do this, like some people think. You just need your mind, a stone ring, and a hobo in a haystack. If you are successful in altering time this way, you will be the only one who remembers it. David asks Corey about some of the strange things that can happen when you jump timelines, like a stone path in the front of your house not being there afterward. Corey says that things get very strange when you start messing with time. Corey mentions that an aspect of time that isn't so well understood is consciousness, which plays a big part in time. All of humanity, as a joint consciousness, when joining together can act as a rudder for a timeline. In the following episode of Cosmic Disclosure, I offered a discussion on the link between time and consciousness. Related Cosmic Disclosure Episode 13, Portals, Navigating Time, Summary and Analysis Corey Good and David Wilcock. Corey expands by saying that a lot of people are waiting for saviors to come and save us, such as ETs or spiritual entities. But that all these higher beings that are watching are waiting for us to save ourselves, to overcome our negative programming, to look within and do it ourselves. Crowd goes wild. Someone uploaded a short clip of this rousing address that night. U2.b web link. David mentions that this Cabal group is using technology that they classified from the Celtics, going all the way back to Roman times. Today, we don't know what happened before the Romans invaded the British Isles, we don't know what Stonehenge was for, to us it's a mystery. But this group knows. And this group used it to systematically take over the world. Great Britain was fighting with countries like Spain and Portugal during the Renaissance and came out on top, despite all odds. Influences in the American colonies. David says they are going to skip ahead to the 1700s and the founding fathers of the United States, what he terms the American breakaway group. David asks Corey if the founding fathers were doing something good when they tried to break away from Great Britain. Corey says the motives of most of the people were good, as far as he is concerned. But this was a plan that was set forth by ancient think tanks a long time ago. David mentions the story of Saint Germain appearing in Congress, when the doors were locked from the inside, when the founders of the United States were debating if they should sign the Declaration of Independence. I found an excerpt from the book Washington and His Generals, or, Legends of the Revolution, by George Lippard, published in 1847, allegedly detailing this speech. Faced with the death penalty for high treason, courageous men debated long before they picked up the quill pen to sign the parchment that declared the independence of the colonies from the mother country on July 4, 1776. For many hours they had debated in the State House at Philadelphia, with the lower chamber doors locked and a guard posted. According to Jefferson, it was late in the afternoon before the delegates gathered their courage to the sticking point. The talk was about axes, scaffolds, and the gibbet, when suddenly a strong, bold voice sounded. Gibbet. They may stretch our necks on all the gibbets in the land, they may turn every rock into a scaffold, every tree into a gallows, every home into a grave, and yet the words of that parchment can never die. They may pour our blood on 1,000 scaffolds, and yet from every drop that dies the axe a new champion of freedom will spring into birth. The British king may blot out the stars of God from the sky, but he cannot blot out his words written on that parchment there. The works of God may perish, his words, never. The words of this declaration will live in the world long after our bones are dust. To the mechanic in his workshop they will speak hope, to the slave in the mines freedom, but to the coward kings, these words will speak in tones of warning they cannot choose but hear. Continue reading. David asks Corey if he heard about this strange character. Corey says yes, and it wasn't the only time. The Inner Earth people sent several interventions to the early colonists during the time this was all happening. David mentions that they are going to show the audience information about Corey's Inner Earth trip from September 2015, later in the talk. David asks Corey to give a brief synopsis of what an Inner Earth civilization is. Corey says there are civilizations that claim to have been here for nearly 20 million years. Some of them say they are the original human race that evolved on the Earth, and that the current stock of surface humans are a mixture of refugees from the Tiamat disaster and their distant cousins from other civilizations, the left on the surface during times of cataclysm, while they took shelter underground. David says this culture would be considered fourth density in law of one terms. David mentions that there are some reports from George Washington that say he met with green skins, that looked human but had green skin. These could have been one of the Inner Earth groups. David mentions Revolutionary War soldiers having their wounds healed, glowing miraculously as it happened. David adds it definitely seems like tampering was going on to make sure America came about. David mentions Francis Bacon also created a document called the New Atlantis, which was the manifesto that laid out the colonization of America in the first place. Related the New Atlantis secret mysteries of America's beginnings and connections to Atlantis. Early beginnings of the modern-day secret space program. David mentions a show coming out on Gaia.com called Deep Space, an ancient alien-style show. It is going to cover what was probably the first space program, with these airships that were seen flying over the Midwest in the 1800s. They landed, and humans came out of them who spoke a conventional language. Corey says that he heard they were secret society related. Most recently, he heard that there were secret societies developing ancient technologies, back then, with what they had for science during those rudimentary times. In some cases the technology would be a hybridization of anti-gravity with potentially an air balloon type technology. David mentions John Keely, who in the late 1800s, was doing anti-gravity demonstrations for the US military. He says this technology did exist back then. David says in the early 1900s, they perfected anti-gravity. David begins to cover how Victor Schauberger discovered anti-gravity vortexes in water, studying the way trout swim upstream. He realized that using sacred geometry and the golden mean ratio that anti-gravity could be generated. Victor Schauberger diagram. Victor Schauberger diagram. David says it turns out that the egg shape is an ideal geometry for making vortexes in water the trout use to swim upstream, taking advantage of naturally occurring pockets of anti-gravity in the flowing water. The trout swim up to the waterfall and literally levitate. I couldn't find a clear-cut example of levitation, but I did find the below video with a few interesting instances of trout seemingly floating up the waterfall. Whether or not they are levitating I can't confirm. A little after the 55-second mark, there is one example in particular that is very clear. U2.b web link. David says that Schauberger discovered places in the current of the flowing water where it moved much faster and the fish would do a crazy dance that allowed them join with the vortex there, levitating up the waterfall afterward. David mentions egg-shaped rocks could levitate too, and when they got to the top of the waterfall, there would be some kind of endothermic reaction, freezing the water at there because things got cold in the process. Corey mentions that sometimes certain types of anti-gravity craft can have the same cooling effect such as the John Searle device, but not all have this effect. David says that the egg shape and the vortex are described well in this image. David says there's an experiment you can do at home, if you have a certain kind of flask, where you whisk an egg submerged in water halfway down the flask, and the egg will start to rise because of this anti-gravity effect. Dan Winter has mentioned that when remote viewers looked at the heart of hydrogen atom, they saw the same embedded tornado shape, the torus, what has been called a scroll work of light. They saw the same vortex structure when they remote viewed the interior of the Sunday. The torus configuration is the most efficient geometry for self-organized bodies we know of. This is essentially a diagram for over-unity physics or the organic system for exchanging energy with self-organized bodies, life, with the cosmos at large, what has been called free energy. The electromagnetic field around the body, produced mainly by the heart, has a similar shape. David says Schauberger eventually created a device called the repulsion that allowed him to harness anti-gravity, which the German secret space program used to create highly advanced spacecraft. Victor Schauberger's repulsion. Corey says that an engine component for one of the craft developed was a result of Schauberger's work. Some of the bubbles used in alien reproduction vehicles are these engines Corey are mentioning. In other words, Schauberger's work was kept hidden, being developed in secret, eventually leading to the development of anti-gravity spacecraft used by the early German secret space program. Example of a Bell engine craft. Corey says the bottom part of the early Nazi craft had a Bell engine that produced anti-gravity, hence the well-known term Nazi Bell craft. David continues to talk about the Nazi Bell, showing slides of ARVs developed using Schauberger's technology, run by German secret societies. Corey mentions there were several secret societies that were behind the Nazi Party and were using it for their own ends. In the following Cosmic Disclosure episodes, this section of SSP history is covered in greater detail. Related Cosmic Disclosure Season 2, Episode 1, Contact is Made, Summary and Analysis Corey Goode and David Wilcock. Related Cosmic Disclosure Season 2, Episode 2, Agar Thence, Advancing the Frontier, Summary and Analysis Corey Goode and David Wilcock. Related Cosmic Disclosure Season 2, Episode 4, Breakaway Begins, Summary and Analysis Corey Goode and David Wilcock. Related Cosmic Disclosure Season 2, Episode 5, Raiders of Lost Technology, Summary and Analysis Corey Goode and David Wilcock. Related Cosmic Disclosure Season 2, Episode 6, We Were Never Alone, Summary and Analysis Corey Goode and David Wilcock. The German Breakaway Group. David says these craft could explore space, and the Germans decided to go explore the solar system. But they found others there, the Super Federation groups that have been here since the outer barrier went down 500,000 years ago. And these other groups didn't want the Germans messing around in the solar system. The Germans actually sustained heavy casualties while they were exploring the solar system and beyond, losing many ships. Corey says they didn't have many ships to lose either. David says that the Germans decided to ally with the Draco, one of the most violent self-serving groups out there. Corey says in the early 1900s the Germans were going around to all sorts of old places in the world, such as monasteries in Tibet, gathering documents, artifacts, and interrogating priests for their secrets. They heard through these interactions about the inner earth beings that live within the earth's crust. Corey adds that the Germans were making contacts through channeling or mediumship via groups like the Vril Society. The Germans had a lot of different ways that they used to build up their knowledge to get to the point where they were ready to explore space and break away. David says that one of his insiders told him that a major agreement was struck in 1939 between the Draco and the Germans in the Himalayas. Corey says he knew a lot happened in the Himalayas but that the contacts made there were with a Nordic-looking group, not the Draco. David introduces some of the new artwork Corey and his team of volunteers have been working on. Corey thanks them for all their hard work. He then says that the images are a depiction of Germans, appearing to humans on the surface as ETS to gather intel and spy on the people in general. The images are depictions of Maria Orsic, a Vril Society medium who made contact with several groups helping the Germans propel their secret space programs forward. She allegedly was seen at an ET contact from the 1950s, which David and Corey discuss later. David sees the symbol for the Order of the Black Sun, which is one of the deeper occult orders within the Cabal. David mentions that appearing to people as ETs is what the Inner Earth people claim to be doing as well. Corey says that the Germans followed their Inner Earth allies' lead, and started doing the same thing for their own purposes. David talked about the Billy Meyer ET contact case and the entity known as Semjace, a human ET that he apparently had contact with in the 1950s. Corey mentions he heard that when the military found out about Meyer's case, they sent people over with some photographs for him to try and identify the female being he saw. He quickly pointed out one photograph, saying, "That's her. That's her." Apparently the photo he pointed out was of Maria Orsic, the medium from the Vril Society, who was making contact with Inner Earth groups, and who played an intimate role in the pre- and post-World War II German secret space program. Vril Society medium, Maria Orsic. David says once this alliance was secured between the Germans and the Draco gave a piece of land to the Germans allowing them to colonize the moon. Depiction of a Nazi base on the moon. Corey says that the base was small, with the arms of the swastika possibly the size of shipping containers. David says that this base was in Draco-protected territory on the moon. David mentions they also went to Mars. Corey says that the Germans tried to settle near the equator on Mars, but there were heavy lightning storms that blew out all their electronics. And these bases were lost along with people there. But they eventually realized that the polar regions were safer, as well as some other areas underground. But some of these places were already occupied by native ET groups which they had to fight off. David mentions that the Germans needed the industrial might of the United States to continue their efforts of expanding into space. Corey says that the US was building 7 to 10 tanks for every one destroyed by the Nazis during the war, so they knew about the industrial might of the US and wanted it for their own purposes. They wanted it to do what they were unable to do in the past, which was to build out their secret space program infrastructure. David says that even though the Nazis lost World War II, they had a lot of basic infrastructure already developed, in Antarctica, on the Moon and on Mars. They had spacecraft that could leave our solar system, and they had alliances that provided support for their agenda. The battle between the German and American groups. David mentions how in 1947 the Germans were already defeated, but they had an Antarctic base they set up before the start of the war. The Americans learned of this via interrogations being done of paperclip Germans brought over to the military-industrial complex after the war. Corey says the Americans sent Admiral Byrd with a major Navy contingent to the southern continent during Operation High Jump to deal with these German bases there. The effort was a major failure, as Byrd encountered heavy German resistance such as highly advanced craft and weaponry. Corey adds that in Antarctica there were ancient city complexes beneath the ice, left in almost pristine condition that the Germans outfitted for their own purposes. There were also ruins of ancient cities above the ice that were ravaged by glaciers over the eons. He also says, due to thermal activity in Antarctica, there are massive underground ice caverns that can serve as dwellings. He says there were at least 3 of these ancient cities beneath the ice. The Germans were informed about these sites from their alliances as well as pristine subterranean sites in South America. Related Antarctic tunnels as tall as the Eiffel Tower found connections to Operation High Jump and secret German bases. David mentions that these ancient cities in Antarctica were probably built at a time when the continent was not covered by glaciers. 12,000 years ago is when the conditions were right to build them. He goes on to suggest that there have been pole shifts in the Earth's past and these could have reoriented the positions of Earth such that Antarctica may have been closer to the equator in the past. He says perhaps the civilization in Antarctica could have been Atlantis of legend. Corey says that the civilization there was highly technological. Some of the buildings found were stone, and some were composite materials. David continues by mentioning Operation High Jump, where the U.S. military staged an invasion of Antarctica. Corey says that the Americans thought that the Nazis only had a small installation of higher-level personnel there. They thought they could just go take them out with little effort. But, as was mentioned earlier, this was not the case. Strange craft started popping up out of the water when Byrd got down there, and wreaked they havoc on his fleet. David says that after High Jump, a 5-year delay in major activity took place, where the paperclip Germans were trying to recruit the Americans into their secret space program. Corey says that between 1947 and 1952, there were multiple meetings happening at different Air Force bases, where advanced German Bell spacecraft were landing to negotiate. The Americans had their own secret space program, but it was much less advanced than the Germans at the time. Apparently part of the Germans' negotiation tactic was to give older technology to the Americans, who thought it was highly advanced. The Americans later used it to create their own ARVs or alien reproduction vehicles. The Germans were pushing their agenda onto the Americans, trying to get their scientists to work on the Germans' programs. David mentions how in 1952 there was a major set of UFO sightings that are important to this part of the story. He thought they were genuine ET craft, until he learned of what Corey thought of the sightings, which was they were not ETs but Nazi Bell craft. David shows a headline from July 28, 1952 of the Washington Post. David mentions how these UFO sightings triggered Project Blue Book, a government whitewash. Essentially the effort was an attempt to label the UFO phenomenon, which was taken very seriously before this, as nothing more than earthly events. After the whitewash, all serious inquiry into UFOs ended, becoming a taboo topic of research. David reiterates there was a major sighting of Nazi Bell craft over Washington, D.C. in 1952, which he thought were ETS until he spoke to Corey. An alleged photograph of the 1952 Washington, D.C. UFO sighting. David says the government is taking the stance that the people can't handle the truth. David says that at the same time all this was happening, positive moves were taking place. He refers to the law of free will in the universe and how each side gets to play their part. In 1952 positive benevolent channeling starts to happen with beings who are blonde Nordics. And people were also having physical contact with these beings as well. Corey says that these benevolent contacts were a mixture of inner Earth groups and German breakaway groups, the same German group that broke away to Antarctica and beyond as a result of their secret space program advances. David says, for clarity, the US did not want to tell the truth to the people about what happened at the Roswell crash in 1947. Corey says that the Americans' craft recovered at Roswell, but it was more advanced than they could reverse engineer at the time. David says that the Americans were looking at the German technology as well and were amazed by what they had developed. When the Germans tried to force the issue, by blowing the lid off the ET cover-up during these flybys over US cities, the Americans became very anxious. The Germans were trying to force the Americans into agreements to exploit their industrial might. Corey says the powers that be did not want free energy technology getting out into the public domain, as this would end the energy cartel's reign of dominance that have been set up via big oil companies, such as Standard Oil. And they wanted to maintain the Babylonian money magic slavery system. These are the reasons why the UFO issue was classified higher than the nuclear bomb. Corey adds that the German group knew, through the contacts they inserted into the American military apparatus via Operation Paperclip, that the Americans were staunchly opposed to any information, related to UFOs or extraterrestrial technology, being disclosed to the public. With this knowledge in hand, the Germans were trying to force the issue with the Americans, saying we will disclosure the truth to the public, we will tell them about free energy technology that will bring down your control systems and your empire, unless you play ball with us. David says that there was a sort of German-American Cold War that raged after World War II, and the Americans thought that they could outspy the Germans, and win. Corey says that the Germans and the Americans had the same idea, which was to infiltrate and take over the opposing group. The group that ended up winning was not the one people think, it was the German group. David says that the whole secret space program, and regular space program, has heavily Nazi-influenced as a result. Corey clarifies that it's not exactly Nazis in the way people may think. The Germans behind this effort have a different belief system that diverges from the Nazis, going back millennia, but that these people are willing to do all manner of immoral things to realize their plans, just like the Nazis. Mass recruitment for the SSP during the brain drain. David mentions after the German-American merger was complete, and they finally got a hold of the industrial resources they needed, a huge recruitment process began called the brain drain era. Another of his insiders, Pete Peterson, said that in the 1950s and on into the early 1960s, 55 to 60 million of the brightest and best scientists in the world were pulled into the secret program. Corey says that he can verify Peterson's claim, and that he saw the dog and pony show these recruits got when being pulled in. He says they were recruited under what he calls the Jetsons package, where they are told they will live a space-age type lifestyle, like the Jetsons. A family would agree to go, get on the ship, arrive at the location only to discover that it was all a lie. They are taken to one of these off-world colonies, made to work in the industrial apparatus there as literal slaves. In other words, many of these people were recruited under false pretenses. The recruits were considered the property of the corporation. David says that 55 to 60 million people is a huge number that can be expanded to work for the programs as they grew. Corey says that in many cases these people were told to be fruitful and multiply. The children of the first recruits would have no contact with the earth, making them a perfect generation of totally controlled slaves. Corey actually visited one of these Mars colonies, which can be read about here. David says that after this American-German infiltration merger, the secret space program grew into 5 factions. Solar Warden being the oldest. Factions of the secret space program, Solar Warden. Corey says that in these programs, sometimes called special access programs, different projects are given the same name, such as the Military Intelligence Program, which was also called Solar Warden. So a lot of people hear about one program and assume that is the only one, when in fact, there could be many different programs with the same name. But there was also a higher, more advanced program, given the same name, which is the Solar Warden most people have heard of. Related Solar Warden, Secret Space Program. David says, remembering from the Cosmic Disclosure shows with Corey, that Solar Warden are responsible for monitoring all the incoming and outgoing traffic in the solar system. Corey agrees, adding that if a vessel arrives in the solar system and does not show the proper protocol, sending a friend or foe signal, then they were most likely hostile and treated as such. A lot of unscheduled visitations are marauder groups that try to come in and take something, leaving shortly afterward. He says there are ways of energetically tagging some of these vessels so that SSP allies can go after them and track them down later. David asks if Solar Warden was the faction Corey actually worked in, to which Corey says, yes he did. Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate. David introduces the next faction, the Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate, ICC. Corey says this faction was born out of the military-industrial complex, which is heavily compartmentalized. Often what happens is, these technology companies will build components but are not told what they are used for. The pieces are built, then shipped somewhere and put together. So no one really knows what they are building until the end. This goes all the way up to the heads of the companies, on their boards, who usually don't know what is happening either. A lot of times people on these boards will be asked to retire so they can join a superboard for the ICC. This superboard is a massive conglomerate of many different companies all around the world and beyond, developing SSP technologies and infrastructure in space. The military-industrial complex, a for-profit loose organization of defense contractors, essentially expanded their profit-generating schemes into space, but the ultimate goal was not earning money, it was developing advanced technology to give them an advantage over other groups, including the population of Earth. The ICC is also the largest and most powerful of the groups, acting as a type of figurehead for all the factions, except the Dark Fleet. David adds they have mining operations, production, and so on. Global Galactic League of Nations. David introduces the next faction, the Global Galactic League of Nations, a carrot that was thrown to the other countries who knew secret space programs were being developed and wanted to get involved. Corey says this is more of a scientific exploratory organization made up of people from every nation on the planet. David mentions that Corey actually visited one of the bases, on a moon orbiting a gas giant in another star system, which can be read about here. Corey describes the base, how it had a pool of water for recreation and a security checkpoint. He also says that you could see the national flag of each person there in Stargate Atlantis-style jumpsuits. Notice the US flag on the left shoulder of their uniforms. Although it is not visible in this photo. The character on the left is from Canada, and in the series a Canadian flag is on his uniform. The military faction. David introduces the next group, which is the military faction. Corey says this faction is made up of many different special access programs. The Navy has some programs, the Air Force has programs, and almost every major military power on the planet has programs that work together in some capacity. Corey emphasizes that their access level is to lower technology and low Earth orbit only. He says these programs are heavily compartmentalized and they do not have access to higher level secrets. These groups are told that everything they are tracking in the sky is man-made, that ETS have been here in the past, but long since left the solar system. In other words, they're told there are no genuine ET craft, only our secret advanced spacecraft. Corey said recently he was told by one of these lower-level military persons that, the inner Earth people discussed later are actually from our future, and that there are no ETS, all the ancient ruins we've found on Earth and beyond are actually future humans coming back into our past. This notion of future humans coming back to the Earth, seeding Kielvisayan, leaving ruins, and engaging with the powers that be sounds remarkably like Dan Buriska's testimony related to P-52S, P-45S and the Looking Glass Project. Perhaps his account is an example of this lower-level SSP cover story. Corey's anecdote regarding the military person is one example of how the compartmentalization programs work. In this case, the military faction was told that ancient builder race ruins and technology are from future humans coming back to our time. They are also told in this faction that their intel is the highest and best, giving them a sense of false pride. In most cases, persons in this faction would rather fight to the death than admit the story they were told might not be true. And, people in this faction are the most vocal about saying anything related to genuine ET or SSP activity is nonsense, as they claim to know all. David says that this partial disclosure narrative is based on these lower-level groups that want to make their version of the story the narrative Corey just described, the official disclosure story. Corey adds that each special access program has their own version of the story as well, so even within the partial disclosure groups there is conflict. Corey and David discuss the Earth-based alliance and the partial disclosure effort extensively in the below-linked article. And below that are two examples of the partial disclosure scenario, which is actively taking place at this time. Related Cosmic Disclosure Season 3, Episode 8, Inner Earth, Debriefing with the Alliance, Summary and Analysis Corey Good and David Wilcock. Related Top Secret UFO Documents Prove Britain's Biggest Alien Sighting Was Real, Claims U.S. Naval Officer. Related Thousands of documents disclosing aliens UFOs soon to be released by U.S. Navy whistleblower. David reiterates that there has been a massive insurgency against the cabal coming from different groups. Some are from the SSP while others are from these lower-level military programs, and some are from Earth-based alliances, who've all come to realize the status quo needs to change, but not that full disclosure is the way to do it. The Dark Fleet. David introduces the Dark Fleet, saying this faction is probably the one that is responsible for pissing off the other factions. Corey says the Dark Fleet has been very secretive and that very little is known about them. They have their own facility on the Moon, separate from the Lunar Operations Command, LOC, which is now being used by the SSP Alliance, a group that began to break away from the cabal-run SSP in an effort to free humanity via full disclosure, which will be discussed more later. When the Dark Fleet has been at the LOC for various meetings, they do not interact with other groups, they have a very cold air about them, they are very stormtrooper-ish, wearing black uniforms, and so on. The Dark Fleet is a human-based group, but they work side by side with the Draco, helping them fight their enemies. This faction is more into human trafficking and the trafficking of genetic materials from Earth. David mentions how the Guardians of the Galaxy film has a lot of soft disclosure in it, showing people from Earth being pulled into a space program, just like what happened in the Brain Drain. Special Access Programs, Umbrella Faction. David introduces the Special Access Programs Umbrella Faction. Corey says these programs fall under military intelligence, breaking down quite a bit from there. David says that when you combine all these factions together, they have over 100 colonies just within our solar system alone. Corey says that some of these colonies are producing goods from raw materials that have been mined in the solar system, which are then taken to manufacturing sites where all different types of technologies are being produced. In all of these cases, the personnel that operate the facilities actually live there on site. The bulk of this industrial initiative, in the programs at large, are centered on Mars. David mentions that Corey has said that some of these other industrial sites are located on moons in the solar system as well. Corey confirms that is the case, but that he can't divulge more due to operational security because some of these facilities were taken over by the SSP Alliance. David continues, saying that in the 1980s the Reagan administration had the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or the Star Wars program and nuclear arms race, which created a huge amount of debt that secretly funded the Solar Warden faction. Corey says that they built a defense grid around the Earth, weapons platforms, and space stations they service on a regular basis. That's where a lot of the money went. Corey's personal experience in Solar Warden. David says the next part of our story is that Corey gets pulled into the program in 1987, after he was groomed for the position as a child. Corey doesn't discuss his experiences much here, but in the following Cosmic Disclosure episode, he covers his involvement with the MyLab program as a young man. Related Cosmic Disclosure Episode 11, Potential of Human Consciousness, Summary and Analysis. Corey Good and David Wilcock. Corey says that the ships weren't as glamorous as what one would see on shows like Star Trek. The ships were designed by people who used to build submarines, and had knee-knocking bulkhead doorways, wherein, in order to cross the threshold, one needed to lift their leg over a sealed doorway, that was high enough to bang against your knee, hence the term knee knockers. He said the ships were compact, like an recreational vehicle or caravan, but it was roomy. The engine room was the largest room in the ship, with a 30-foot tall ceiling. They had cargo areas that were also large, but these were not entered into frequently. The whole ship was modular, in that the cargo areas could be compressed down or expanded for various functions. There were also food printers that could replicate food with a limited menu, but they didn't taste right, and sometimes would cause disturbed digestion for days after eating, until one got used to it. David mentions that he wants to talk about the weird stuff, saying that after Corey was recruited into the program, in 1987, he did his 20-year tour of duty, and then was brought back in time to the day that he left. This was done through time travel technology. Corey explains that at the end of a tour of duty, an asset is debriefed, recounting the experience, and age regressed or biologically turned back to the time before you left. During this process, scars, tattoos or any other markings are wiped clean due to the temporal regression methods used. The technology for this was a kind of paneling they placed around the body, while in a heavily sedated state to keep the body completely still throughout the process. David says that this is called the 20 and Back program. Corey says that he was almost 17 when he was recruited. He signed all these papers saying he agreed to the program, that he would do his 20-year tour, be brought back to the time that he left, be given a posh job, his college education would be paid for, and so on. Similar to other above-board recruitment offers for enlisted people. David asks what really happens, in contrast to what they promised. Corey says that when people get back, they whip their memories, called blank slating, age regress them, and deposit them back in their lives as if nothing ever happened. No posh job, no paid for college education. Instead of receiving the promised benefit, they wipe your memories so that you remember none of your agreements, or that you even were involved in the program at all. Corey adds that in the beginning, screened memories were implanted using chemicals, but eventually they switched to some energetic process that wiped memory of the program more efficiently. They had a problem with 3% to 5% of the people in the intuitive empathy program who were able to break the mind wiping, and recall their memories as time went on. Corey is an intuitive empathy, which is someone who has innate skill with receiving information intuitively, what could also be called a clairvoyant. These skills were enhanced by several sophisticated techniques in the program, including virtual reality simulations. The mind wiping would work for a few days or weeks with intuitive empaths, but then the memories would come back. The reason Corey provides for this is because the physical brain stores memories, like a hard drive, but the energetic body stores in a sort of virtual cloud database. The intuitive empaths had a better connection to this energetic body that would re-download the memories into their brain, just like restoring a hard drive from a backup. But recalling memories is not easy, and the whole effort is very intensive, just like any memory reintegration process. David asks if they re-abducted these people to re-wipe them. Corey says that they would pull people back in to do that, but chemical wiping, done too many times, would have major complications. David asks if Corey remembers signing the paperwork after the blank slate. Corey says that the paperwork is signed just after you leave. After being blank slated, you essentially remember nothing about the paperwork, and they also use screened or fake memories, filling in any gaps left by the wiping process. Essentially, when you come back you are in a state of confusion or amnesia about what just happened. But the people who can actually recover their memories have a much more difficult time adjusting back, because they have two timelines of memory. One is the real 20 years they spent in the program, and another false set of screened memories much shorter in duration that are trying to overwrite the others. Subconsciously, these people know something isn't right, yet consciously they can't recall what the divergence is, which causes depression, rejection, PTSD, etc., but with no conscious association as to why. David reminds the audience that everything they have been discussing is available in their series Cosmic Disclosure and on his show Wisdom Teachings on Gaia.com. Summary and analysis for Cosmic Disclosure can be read here as well. Fake alien invasion agenda. David says the Illuminati are putting out a lot of movies talking about alien invasions. Based on what he learned from insiders and other researchers, they have cloning technologies, highly advanced spacecraft, and they've been talking about alien invasion since the 1950s. Corey says that at one time, they did have a plan to have a fake alien invasion scenario via secret space program assets, known to some as Project Blue Beam. David emphasizes the point, saying the cabal was going to use the assets to sell us a fake alien invasion, and in the process, huge collateral damage would take place, helping them realize their depopulation agenda. Corey adds that he was told by his SSP Alliance contacts that they can't enter the Earth's atmosphere without clearance or they will be considered a non-terrestrial threat, a term that is used heavily in the programs. David mentions how the cabal wants to reduce population, just like it says on the Georgia GUID Estons, that they are announcing their NWO, and this fake alien invasion was part of it. Corey says according to the NWO timeline, the planet should have already been under their total control, but it hasn't worked out the way they wanted. Crowd gives applause. The first sphere enters the solar system, the Seeker. David mentions that trouble for them started when a giant sphere showed up in the solar system in the 1980s. This was the first sphere ever seen, called the Seeker. It came in and orbited Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus. All the Bush people at the time were watching it. The insider Pete Peterson said he actually saw images of the sphere, which was about the size of Neptune, and portals could be seen opening on it, to let ships out, with apertures 800 miles in diameter. He said that it looked like a soccer ball on the surface, and that it had strange technology all over it. David says he talked to 3 other insiders who knew about this sphere. They tried to hail the sphere, but it wouldn't respond. When they finally did make contact with it, they said they were peaceful explorers. The SSP craft told the sphere to GTFO, or to leave immediately, which it then did. Corey says he heard about the sphere, but he didn't hear the details about the 800-mile wide apertures. David says the ICC is building highly advanced technology on Mars and that they are actively trading with over 900 ET groups. They build it there, in part, to hide it from people on Earth, to maintain the oil dependency illusion. So the SSP thinks they are really ahead of the game, but then this gigantic sphere shows up, the Seeker. And then the sphere just left, and for many years there was no other sightings of them, until the late 1990s. More spheres entered during the 1990s. David says a major influx of gigantic spheres showed up in the solar system. David shows some SOHO images of large objects called sun cruisers and other phenomenon. Sun cruiser on left-hand size of SOHO disk. From the website mentioned by David, www.cyberspaceorbit.com. A close-up of the sun cruiser from enterprisemission.com. David proceeds to show numerous examples from 1999 through 2005 of these spheres, the size of planets in some cases, that have entered the solar system and are visible in SOHO images. David shows an example of a planet-sized object in a SOHO image that was tracked one day, and the next day was gone, meaning that it must not have been a planet. He then goes over where the planets actually were during this event, demonstrating that the only one in view was Mars, to the left of the Sun, with the Sun cruiser to the right. The above image is an example of a Sun cruiser, but not the same image mentioned by David here. David shows footage of actual spheres moving at high rates of speed, impossible for objects that size. The footage was grainy and looked a lot like the above photo in resolution quality. He showed a close-up, convincing examples of objects flying past SOHO. David covers another event, where 2 objects are seen in SOHO footage flying as if they will pass by the Sun, but they crash in at the last moment. He says they are the spheres, using the Sun as portal. In the process of going into the Sun, a huge coronal mass ejection, CME, blasts out, sending highly charged particles into space. David presents an article showing NASA recognized that comets are rarely seen flying together or crashing into the Sun, but they do not link the event with the CME that occurred immediately after. David says NASA is trying to cover up the CME connection for some reason. David then shows another example of an object flying into the Sun, more directly this time, and a CME immediately occurs after, implying NASA is trying to cover up that the Sun is being used as a portal. Prelude to Corey's involvement with the SSP Alliance. David says on October 13, 2014 Corey contacted David via email, but they had been corresponding since 2008. The email was sent from Corey to David and Benjamin Fulford, referring to Corey's involvement with the SSP. David mentions an article he wrote on October 27, 2014 entitled Cosmic Perspective on the Defeat of the Cabal, describing various aspects of the article that intrigued Corey. David says Corey then contacted him the next day, saying that he was engaged in various internet forums under a pseudonym, but that he's been busy with life in general, and they discussed how they should talk more at some point. Corey says that in 2011, the spheres began to come in at much greater numbers, using the Sun as a portal, but also entering from outside the solar system. He heard through his own contacts in the late 1990s that the spheres were coming into the solar system by the hundreds, but immediately going out of phase, or making themselves invisible. Scientists in the program were able to measure where they were and sent hailing calls to them, requesting friend or foe, etc., but they were unable to make any contact with the spheres. Corey mentions that in the beginning when all the spheres were coming in, the Cabal was very excited. People in the Pentagon were saying it was the return of the Sumerian gods, the Cabal's gods. David adds that the Cabal thought these spheres were going to help them with their NWO, but when they received no response, it scared them. David says that at around the end of the Mayan calendar, December 21, 2012, many more spheres come into the solar system, some the size of Neptune. Corey says that there were thousands of spheres coming in at this point in the timeline. The size ranged from that of our Moon to Neptune and Jupiter, but that the majority of them are the size of Neptune. ISS feed captures particle beam weapon attack on massive sphere. David then mentions that the Cabal tried to fire at one of the spheres using a very powerful particle beam weapon. Corey says that the targeting systems for this weapon was partially in Africa and also in Australia. David then shows some images of the event, which was first reported on December 5, 2014. U2.B web link. David says that the sphere was shot by a weapon that the Cabal thought was their best. The sphere glowed red hot and then reflected the energy back down to the base it was shot from, destroying it. Corey says that the spheres did not attack the base, they used an Aikido principle to reflect the energy back to the source, a form of self-defense. Reservation of the outer barrier. David says that after this provocation by the Cabal, the spheres erect the outer barrier around the solar system. Corey says that the barrier begins where the heliosphere ends and that the barrier prevents all the groups, the Draco, all the SSP factions, the Super Federation, and so on, from leaving or receiving reinforcements from outside of the solar system. He said that communication was further hindered for most of the groups, but some could communicate, specifically mentioning quantum communication devices that the Global Galactic League of Nations were using. And that after this happened, a lot of negotiations began in an effort to let groups in and out of the barrier. David says that before this attack on the sphere, there were no hostilities, but afterward a sort of no-fly zone went up around the Earth. And that the Solar Warden faction of the SSP Alliance was given the task of ensuring no one left or came in without permission. David adds that essentially the entire solar system has been quarantined and all the bad guys are trapped inside, not sure what to expect next. David thinks that this means these beings are going to be held on trial in some kind of tribunal. Crowd gives applause. Corey says that a lot of these groups were expecting to be outside of the solar system before the energetic changes started to happen. David says that the energetic shift is a big subject about the ascension and the evolution of the solar system at large, which he's discussed at length on his show Wisdom Teachings. Related the natural law basis of harvest, the spiritual evolution of Gaia and all who dwell in the system of soul. Related science and evidence for the transformation of the solar system, the divine cosmos by David Wilcock. Corey says most of what is seen in UFO videos of the International Space Station, ISS, are of Solar Warden craft trying to push disclosure by displaying themselves in front of camera feeds. David says after this event in December 2014, he and Corey start taking more and he opened up to David about his involvement in the SSP. 2 SSP Alliance atrocities. David mentions that in February 2015 a massive plume of smoke is seen rising on Mars. Corey confirms this was called the Mars atrocity and that it started with factions who were in the Cabal-run SSPs defecting over to the SSP Alliance, which are allied with the beings who were in control of the spheres, a benevolent group of 5 races known as the Sphere Being Alliance. In the process of these defectors coming over to the SSP Alliance, certain members decided to act on actionable intelligence and destroy a Cabal-run base on Mars, causing the loss of many lives in a settlement nearby. This base was where a key component was being made for some of their technology. David reiterates that the raising of the outer barrier was an unprecedented event, and that the newly formed SSP Alliance took advantage of the situation by destroying one of these facilities on Mars, one of 2 atrocities. David says that the Mars attack caused the death of 250,000 innocent people in the facility, people who were probably recruited under false pretenses and forced to work in the facility as slaves. David says that the second atrocity was an undersea reptilian base off the coast of South Carolina, killing 700. Corey adds that it was a Draco facility that had a number of human test subjects. David says he was at the Consciousness Life Expo last year, talking about the 500-million-year-old history of the solar system, which is now 2.6 as mentioned earlier. Corey was in the audience. He was actually yelled at for David giving the talk because it revealed so much of what was going on. We covered that talk here. But he says that none of the information he gave in that talk came from Corey, it was from his other insiders, but it matched up with Corey's data so well, that he ended up taking the heat for it. Lights on Ceres. David says 8 days after those atrocities, an artificial-looking structure on Ceres is discovered. Related Ceres bright spot colonization of Ceres by a breakaway civilization? Related intelligent life on Ceres? New evidence seems to suggest so. Corey was told that David's talk interrupted a process that was supposed to happen at a certain speed. David changes the subject and begins to go over the Ceres object, which has a number of unexplainable bright spots on it. Ceres bright spot. David says that no matter what the position of Ceres' surface is with the Sun, the spots seem to stay bright and that the phenomenon was discovered using the Hubble telescope back in 2004. David mentions that Linda Moulton Howe discovered a geometric crater to the bottom right of the bright spot. David speculates that this straight-line geometry could be from the roof of a massive subterranean structure or biodome, complete with trees, life, and an ecosystem. Sphere Being Alliance calls for Corey. David says the next day, after they announce the strange object on Ceres, February 27, 2015, the Blue Avians, one of the Sphere Being Alliance races, asks for Corey goodbye name. Before this, Corey was not directly involved in the SSP Alliance, he was only in contact with them in some capacity. David says that the Blue Avians are bird-like humanoids. Artist rendition of a Blue Avian, assisted by Corey's descriptions. David reiterates that these highly evolved beings, who are in control of these massive spheres, actually asked for Corey by name, but that Corey had said to David in the past that he never wanted to go back up there. At this point, Corey was a whistleblower, discussing his past experience during the 20 and Back program. For us, he is considered an insider because of his experiences, but he was actually an outsider to the SSP Alliance, in the sense that he was not directly involved in any SSP activity after his tour of duty. This would cause friction between Corey and the SSP Alliance Council, who was not happy that the Sphere Beings appointed an outsider as their delegate. For more on this, see the below-linked article. Related Cosmic Disclosure Season 3, Episode 8, Inner Earth, Debriefing with the Alliance, Summary and Analysis. Corey Good and David Wilcock. Corey said that after this call for him happened, he started getting monitored heavily by the Special Access Program factions, and the secret space programs in general. He said he was picked up and they had a dossier on him. They were asking him a lot of questions in a not-so-pleasant way. David says that 3 days after this request for Corey went out, on March 1, he was brought up to a meeting using a form of transportation that Corey had never seen before. David says he has spoken about it since then, describing a small blue sphere that flies into the room, which he then acknowledges in some way, letting it know he is ready. Then it expands around his body and takes him away at very fast speeds. Artist depiction of Corey being transported by a sphere. David says that this image is of Corey being taken to the lunar base, the LOC, using one of the transport spheres that encases him in a purple light. Corey said that after the LOC meeting that day, he left again to see one of the Blue Avian beings, Ra-Tiri-Ir, where he saw the massive spheres in the solar system as he flew by. Artist depiction of Corey seeing the spheres. There are only a few represented in this version. But there are actually thousands of them according to Corey. Corey says he was told the spheres were acting as a resonant buffer to the energies that were coming into our solar system, due to energies from the galaxy. Rothir, the blue avian, said that because of our current state of development, if they didn't have these spheres here, our bodies wouldn't be able to handle the changes. The concept of entrainment or synchronization is helpful here, I think. This energetic shift can be tracked by observing climate changes on all major bodies in the solar system. Eventually the sun will shift into a higher energy state of expression, altering life in the solar system dramatically via an entrainment process. For more on this, see the following. Related: is this a sign of increased energy affecting the Earth? Global earthquake and volcanic activity spiked last week. Related: DNA and evolution expected to increase over the coming years due to cosmic radiation intensifying as we enter another solar minimum. U2.B web link. Corey adds that since a majority of the people on the planet are so negative that the energies would cause a type of end times madness if there wasn't the dampening or graduation effect from the spheres. But the people who are more positive would be blissed out, not receiving telekinetic powers at first, but those would come with time. He said that this would have been a quick and uneasy transition for humanity, if it weren't for these spheres. David shows 3D rendering of a blue avian. Corey's first meeting with the SSP Alliance Council. David recounts the story when Corey met Lieutenant Colonel Gonzalez, a figure in the SSP Alliance, who brought Corey to a large room at the base on the moon. Corey says that when he was brought up to the LOC base, he was pulled on stage and sat in front of many high-level military-type people who comprise the SSP Alliance Council, for an unpleasant interview. The SSP Alliance is made up of former Cabal-run secret space programs, who are hardly angelic beings, to quote Corey. What distinguishes them is their desire for full disclosure and an end of the enslavement of the human race. But as David discussed above with the atrocities committed by members of this group, they lack wisdom insofar as morality to bring about the change harmoniously. They were not happy that the toughest guys on the block, the sphere beings, wanted an outsider to represent them, as Corey will detail in shortly. David says this is the same alliance that wants to free the people, give humanity all the Star Trek-like technology that they have and do data dumps or full disclosure, in contrast to the partial disclosure effort of the other Earth-based alliances. David reiterates that Corey was brought up to the LOC and dragged in front of the SSP Alliance Council. Corey was being heckled by people in the audience, partially because he had a NASA baseball cap on, suggesting this was not the right audience for that kind of attire. Corey says there were a couple guys up in the front who asked him what he was doing there. He responded saying he didn't know, shoving his hands into his pockets nervously. Someone from the audience shouted out, "Remove that ridiculous cover," referring to his NASA baseball hat. Corey mentions that when he was leaving the house earlier, he just grabbed the first hat he could find, and it just so happened to be a NASA hat. Corey continues his recount of the SSP Alliance Council meeting, saying back on stage, he pulled the hat off, looked at it and realized how preposterous it was to be wearing a NASA cap in the SSP Alliance Council meeting, of all places, then throws it off to the side. Corey adds that the night before, his daughter decided to draw a green dinosaur on Corey's hand, which was still visible at the meeting the next day. They asked Corey why he had an image of a reptilian on his left hand. Corey tried to rub the drawing off but wasn't successful. David says for about 15 minutes this was happening, and Corey had no idea what was going on other than the fact he was being ridiculed. Corey says that everyone was loitering around the room for a while, but then it got quiet and people began to sit down. He turned around to see Rothir, the blue avian, standing behind him. As an interesting synchronicity, the exact moment in the live stream playback when Corey says this being was standing behind him, the timecode read, 3:33:33. Rothir, the blue avian. One of the 5 sphere being alliance races. David says that standing beside the blue avian, Corey also sees one of the other sphere being races, the triangle head beings. Triangle head beings, one of the 5 sphere being alliance races. Corey says that this image is still being worked on, that the chest and rib cage is actually smooth in appearance. David says this entity is called the Golden Triangle Head Being. Corey says at this point in the meeting, the triangle head being just stands there with his arms waving around a bit, standing on its toes like tripods. He said that the being was undulating in place as a normal part of its standing posture. David says that the blue avian starts talking to Corey telepathically. Corey says that he beings to interface with the blue avian, Ra-Tiri-Ir, and then corrects himself, saying that the being is not a he or she. The being begins to interface with Corey, telepathically telling him what to say to the SSP Alliance Council assembled in front of him. The Sphere Being's message and SSP Alliance agenda. Corey says that a lot of people in the SSP Alliance Council were excited, thinking they were finally going to meet this highly advanced race, with powerful technology that was going to give them a plan to kick butt and realize their goals to free humanity. Instead, Ra-Tiri-Ir has him repeat a hippie love message about forgiveness that was not computing at all for them. They were making jokes about sticking daisies in machine guns, it was a joke to them. They are military-minded people who think they need to bomb their way out of any situation. This is a good point in the narrative to present the introduction from Corey's website, which summarizes who he is, what the SSP Alliance is, who the Sphere Beings are and what their message is. Introduction. By Corey Good. With all of the events occurring above and below, there is a lot of information, disinformation, and competing agendas that are all competing for fertile places in our consciousness to plant their seeds. Some people have chosen to focus on the more down-to-earth events and the battles over the financial debt system, Babylonian money magic slave system, financial resets, financial jubilee, and gifted money to the masses in prosperity settlements. There is an element of what we call the alliance that is fighting the current controlling elite, known as the Cabal or Illuminati among other names, down here on Earth at this very moment. Some people have chosen to focus on the more esoteric, for now, events and battles occurring above our atmosphere in what many are referencing as the secret space programs and breakaway civilizations. There is quite a lot of classified technologies that are in use in these programs that are being suppressed and could completely change the nature and quality of life of every human being here on Earth. The free energy technologies would end the need of the current oil/petro energy companies, the frequency and light healing technologies would end the current pharmaceutical corporations, the neurological interface technologies would end the need for large education institutions, and the food replication technologies and environmental purification and restoration technologies would end poverty, starvation, and begin to reverse the damage humanity has done to the Earth virtually overnight. As you can imagine, the real threat to disclosure is not that humanity cannot handle the truth or will be able to reconcile cosmic life with their religious beliefs. The real reason is that these technologies would immediately collapse the world economies and make the Babylonian money magic slave system of no use anymore. It means the loss of control of the 0.01% elite over the masses and a complete paradigm change. In short, it means freedom. Freedom for the first time in humanity's known recorded history. There has been a stealth civil war going on among various SSP groups for a while to achieve this result. Relatively recently, the SSP Alliance was joined by a group of beings that no one had encountered before. They are a 6-9th density group of beings that have been referred to as the Sphere Alliance. These new sphere beings have since not only created an energetic blockade around Earth but have also done so around our entire solar system. They are a non-violent group of beings who have brought assistance mainly in the form of a message. Some people are now choosing to focus on this message that was delivered by the Blue Avians, one of 5 beings, the Orb beings, the Blue Avians, the Golden Triangle-headed beings, and 2 others who have not revealed themselves to us yet. The Orb beings have been visiting many tens of thousands of people in the form of blue/indigo balls of light, while others have been visited by the Blue Avians and given a greeting phrase to know one another by. What is this message? Every day focus on becoming more service to others oriented. Focus on being more loving and focus on raising your vibrational and consciousness level and to learn to forgive yourself and others, thus releasing karma. This will change the vibration of the planet, the shared consciousness of humanity and change humanity one person at a time, even if that one person is yourself. They say to treat your body as a temple and change over to a higher vibrational diet to aid in the other changes. This sounds to many like a hippie love and peace message that will not make a difference. I assure you the path they lay out in their message is a difficult one. Even on the unlikely chance that these technologies stay suppressed, imagine what a world we would live in if everyone made these changes to themselves. The Blue Avians also gave a warning with this message. They had tried to deliver this message 3 other times and it had been distorted by humanity. They made it very clear that this information was not to become a cult or religious movement, nor was I to put myself, my ego, before the message or elevate myself to a guru status. Anyone who does so should be avoided and held accountable, including myself. Thank you. Corey Gudetsky aka Luke. David says, and the SSP Alliance are essentially being told to sit tight and change your ways of thinking, because bombs, violence, and war won't solve the problem. Each person has a responsibility to change themselves, and in the process, the world will change around them. Corey says that the SSP Alliance already paid a big price for the 2 atrocities they mentioned earlier. David adds that some of the people that organized the attacks on the 2 bases were assassinated by cabal infiltrators who made it into the SSP Alliance. More partial disclosure. David says 5 days after this meeting took place, on March 6, an announcement that there were oceans on Mars is released from NASA. David adds that on that same day, NASA announces Ceres will be orbited by a satellite to look at the bright spots. He says the talk from scientists was suggestive of soft disclosure and that this is a partial disclosure effort. David further adds that on the same day, they announce that 22 light-years away, there is a exoplanet. David says that on March 13 Vladimir Putin disappeared, becoming a big story in the press. Corey says that there were days and days of meetings at the LOC, where they were bringing up politicians and regular people, from around the world, for tours. These people who were average Joes were getting to see sections of the LOC that Corey was not able to see, further suggesting that relations between Corey and the SSP Alliance were tenuous, at best. David continues saying that later, President Barack Obama goes on Jimmy Kimmel Live and playfully says that the government is run by aliens. Related Friday, March 13, 2015 Obama admits space aliens control USA, was he joking? David heard from several of his insiders that Obama got into a lot of trouble and was not supposed to do this. U2.B web link. Excerpt from the interview. Kimmel wanted to know whether Obama had tried to get to the bottom of the UFO files about the mysterious desert region known as Area 51. The aliens won't let it happen, Obama joked. You'd reveal all their secrets. They exercise strict control over us. But President Clinton once said he'd checked on the matter and found nothing, Kimmel protested. That's what we're instructed to say, Obama responded. David says the next day after Obama appeared on Jimmy Kimmel Live, Putin reappeared after a 10 absence, saying he was fine. Strange events at Corey's home. David says that after Corey's was brought up for multiple meetings with the SSP Alliance Council, he was harassed on several occasions. Corey says that at the time, the house they were staying it had smart meters, which in and of itself isn't great, but that on 2 occasions, both the meters died, and the city came out to see what happened but couldn't figure it out. People were also breaking into his home during this time, and he decided to install inexpensive video cameras to keep an eye on things. He and his family went to go on a trip at one point, and upon their return, the energy in the house felt very strange. He said that the house looked like the whole thing had been twisted around, with huge cracks in the walls and doors from some kind of disturbance. He said it only happened on their side of the duplex. There were cracks on the neighbor's side but only on the walls touching his house. David reveals images of the cracked walls, clearly showing structural damage along the seams where drywall had pulled away from spackling at the corners. Corey reiterates that prior to their trip, there was no damage, everything was pristine. David continues to show images of cracks coming from doorways going to the seam of a wall, and moving up towards the ceiling. Hacks on government data centers and more partial disclosure. David says that on June 5, a massive hack or breach of data affected all security clearances in the United States. He says that the original article to the story was pulled down shortly after it went up, but he was able to find a copy on archive.org. The link above is from another news outlet. David reviews the article's key points, saying that security information of current and former government employees was stolen. David mentions that in November of 2015 another breach of a DHS contractor for background checks, with of over 25,000 records, was hacked as well. Corey says that people within the SSP Alliance and the Earth-based alliances were working together to do these super hacks to gather information for the big data dump that is for a full disclosure scenario. David mentions a NASA article that came out in May 2015 claiming they have developed warp drive. He covers the article. Corey says that this announcement is planting the seed of preparation that we have the technology to travel much further than the chemical rockets we've had in the past. David adds that this is preparation for the partial disclosure timeline. Corey visits an inner Earth settlement. David mentions that on September 3, 2015 a huge event takes place when Corey visits the inner Earth. David and Corey discuss this even in great detail, in a 6-part sub-series in their show Cosmic Disclosure. Below is the 6th installment, where links to the earlier episodes can be found. Related Cosmic Disclosure Season 3, Episode 8, Inner Earth, Debriefing with the Alliance, Summary and Analysis. Corey Good and David Wilcock. Corey says that as a child, he got to visit a crystal cave in the inner Earth. They asked each of the children there to interface with the crystals as intuitive empaths, but not to touch them or they could damage the crystals or themselves. Some of the children were able to interface whereas some others could not. He said they sort of used the children as a USB drive, in that, they were taken back, debriefed, and then had their memories wiped of the event. Artist depiction of the crystal cave, courtesy of Gaia.com. Corey says the crystals had information on them, but they were alive, so they weren't just storing information, they were constantly processing and creating new information. Corey adds that these caves were being guarded by a race of raptor beings, but he didn't know this at the time he visited the location as a child. He says in this image is a depiction of a royal raptors. David says that these raptors guarded the crystal cave, and that certain groups who have lived within the inner Earth were dismayed because they couldn't get access to them, hence their interest in meeting Corey. David shows an image of another of the beings that reside within the inner Earth. Courtesy of Gaia.com. Corey says that these beings are cavemen-like, first encountered during expeditions to inner Earth by the Germans in the early part of the 20th century. David says that on September 3 Corey was brought to this room within the inner Earth cleansing ceremony room within an inner Earth settlement, courtesy of Gaia.com. Corey says he did know he was going, but he didn't know when and had no details of what to expect. David continues that he ended up in this room where he had to go through a cleansing ceremony, having to get naked, put on robes and leave the room. He met these two guards standing at the doorway to another room used for meetings that looked like this. Courtesy of Gaia.com. David says they are massive limestone caves. He says that Corey eventually got a tour of the facility, and what he found was amazing. Here are some images that look like what Corey saw. Here are some similar images to the ones shown by David. This is actually one of the images presented by David, which Corey said embodied the built-out pillar style of their building designs. Corey says that the cave city was built with stone dwellings and areas that they worked inside of that were lit up like what is shown above. Corey responds to a question from the audience asking how deep below the surface it was, saying, he didn't know. He wasn't told how far down below the surface the inner Earth settlement was. David says that they commissioned images from artists that were used in the Cosmic Disclosure series discussing the visit to inner Earth. Shown below. Wide-angle view of inner Earth city, courtesy of Gaia.com. Courtesy of Gaia.com. courtesy of Gaia.com. Flying cigar spacecraft depicted as flying through the wall using some kind of phasing technology, courtesy of Gaia.com. David says that it's pretty close to what Corey actually saw, which Corey confirms. David says that one aspect are these glowing domes of light and the skyscrapers. Corey says that the domes were smaller and the skyscrapers were taller than what is depicted in the images. He adds that there were spacecraft flying around the cave, and that some of them were going right through the walls as if there was nothing there. He said the craft were a classic UFO configuration as well as egg and large cigar-shaped craft. David shows an artist depiction of where the inner Earth peoples grow their food. Hydroponic agricultural area, courtesy of Gaia.com. Corey says this was a huge hydroponic growing area. He then describes another area he says was a wildlife preserve. Wildlife preserve or park, courtesy of Gaia.com. Corey adds that the park was completely enclosed in a cavern, but had a simulated atmosphere. And in the center of the cave, was a weathered obelisk, with a ball of plasma hovering over the top that was used as a type of artificial sun. Obelisk with plasma ball above, courtesy of Gaia.com. David says he was blown away by this part of Corey's story, because prior to him hearing of this, he commissioned the cover of his new book, The Ascension Mysteries. The final design had an obelisk in the foreground with a light coming off the top and Saturn faded out in the background. David shows the image of his new book, The Ascension Mysteries. Corey says that what David just claimed sounds so fantastic, most people will probably think they made it all up, but in fact, David had no idea that Corey saw the same style obelisk during his Inner Earth trip. Meeting the Inner Earth Alliance Council. David says to take notice that Saturn is behind his image. He then says that Corey meets some of these Inner Earth Alliance beings, and shows images. The Inner Earth Alliance Council is a group of 7 different Inner Earth societies, some claiming to be 20 million years old, the first evolved human race, whereas others claim to have settled below the surface after more recent Ice Age cycles. All the groups can be called breakaway civilizations because each is a remnant of a surface society. In most cases, the parent civilization faded away, and the priest class or elites of that culture took refuge underground, hence the term breakaway civilization. The Inner Earth groups are generally xenophobic in nature, believing in racial purity and protecting themselves from the surface population using elaborate disinformation schemes. Some of the older Inner Earth groups claim to have helped restart civilization on the surface after major and minor cataclysms. Allegedly the Sumerian civilization was assisted by them, wherein they falsely appeared as gods to the people there. In more recent times, due to humanity's improved technological sophistication, they appeared to the surface as extraterrestrials or ascended masters. Recently, these groups formed an alliance after many eons of isolation. This was because they are now at risk of attack from the Cabal, and because they are keenly interested in making contact with a race of beings they revere from antiquity, the Guardians. These Guardians are none other than the Sphere Being Alliance, who the SSP terms the Ancient Builder Race. In a recent meeting that took place in January of this year, Corey, SSP Alliance delegates and the Inner Earth Alliance Council met at a SSP Alliance base in the Kuiper Belt. The Inner Earth peoples finally got a chance to see their beloved Guardians, who told them that they have not been good stewards of the planet. Since that meeting, some of the Inner Earth groups have decided to stop their disinformation campaigns with the surface population, whereas other groups decided to bolster them. The priestess Kari, from one of the older Inner Earth groups, who Corey later discusses he had a mind meld with, represents a group that is interested in more honest dealings the surface. What follows are images of these 7 Inner Earth groups. One of the 7 Inner Earth Alliance Council groups, courtesy of Gaia.com. David says they look human, but Corey mentions that their eyes are a little larger, and they were one of 3 groups wearing Saturn pendants. David then shows another group with an hourglass symbol that have a more African look. One of the 7 Inner Earth Alliance Council groups, courtesy of Gaia.com. David says that their hair is a little lighter in color, which you can see better in this image. courtesy of Gaia.com. David shows another one of the Saturn groups, with paler skin, and a different style gemstone. One of the other Saturn pendant groups, courtesy of Gaia.com. David mentions that Corey has said the gem used by these three different Saturn pendant groups corresponds to a place on Earth where their underground capital cities are located. David introduces the Omega group, and shows an image. One of the 7 Inner Earth Alliance Council groups, courtesy of Gaia.com. Corey says this group didn't seem to be liked very much by some of the other groups and that they had a very similar appearance to the surface population. David shows an image of the last remaining Saturn pendant groups, which were the most spiritual out of all of them, and who were also hosting the Inner Earth Alliance Council meeting he and Gonzalez were there to attend. One of the other Saturn pendant groups that hosted the meeting, Priestess Kari on the left, courtesy of Gaia.com. David shows an image of the Star Pendant Group. One of the 7 Inner Earth Alliance Council groups, courtesy of Gaia.com. David introduces the final, Swastika Pendant, group. One of the 7 Inner Earth Alliance Council groups, courtesy of Gaia.com. Corey mentions that this group has a crystal implanted in their foreheads, under the skin. David says that some of these groups claim to have been around for millions of years, but they are separate groups. However, Corey was told recently, that they formed a council because the Cabal now has technology that is capable of attacking them. Corey confirms that the Cabal and other groups have embassies below the surface. Related under-ocean military bases, lower-level secret space programs. There is more than just one Area 51, see for yourself. Corey's private meeting with the Priestess Kari. David mentions that after the Inner Earth Alliance Council meeting with Corey and Gonzalez, where they discuss many interesting things, Corey had a private meeting with the Priestess Kari. Here is an image of her. The Priestess Kari from one of the 7 Inner Earth groups. Corey said that in this meeting, they had a mind meld type of experience, when his hands touched hers. The Priestess Kari from one of the 7 Inner Earth groups, courtesy of Gaia.com. Corey adds it was a completely overwhelming experience, where he felt like his astral body was being pulled towards hers, with hers towards his, and they were kind of melding in the middle. She was very telepathic, able to sift through Corey's memories with ease, looking for the experience he had in the crystal cave as a child. While this was happening, he was receiving flashes of her life as well. David reminds everyone that this whole Inner Earth story is told in much greater detail on their Cosmic Disclosure show. See the above links to the Inner Earth sub-series. The Inner Earth Library and Hall of Records. David shows this image and asks Corey what it means. A crystal ball held by a metallic hand seen on the library wall of the Inner Earth settlement, courtesy of Gaia.com. Corey says that after the mind meld, they entered the library via teleportation, and he happened to look up to see a thin gold, almost steel rebar in thickness hand, holding a crystal ball, coming from the top of the ceiling. Corey says that as they walked through the library, they came to rows and rows of scrolls, that looked like this. Scrolls in the Inner Earth Library, courtesy of Gaia.com. Corey said it was like walking through time, seeing old scrolls, tablets, books bound in strange materials. Then he came to more modern-style bookcases that had contemporary books with ISBN numbers on them. She told him they only keep physical copies of books they are interested in, but had non-physical copies as well. David then continues on with the story, saying Corey ended up in a room with egg-shaped chairs. Levitating egg-shaped chairs in the library? Corey says in this room, people were reaching out with their minds to people on the surface, or they were sitting around in circles having a conference call via telepathic contact. Corey adds that there were well over 200 chairs, just in this one area, for telepathic contacts. In the Cosmic Disclosure show, Corey says that the Inner Earth groups make contact with people on the surface via channeling, claiming to be ETS or Ascended Masters. This was their attempt to hide their true location from the surface people, and an effort to raise the consciousness of the people in general. but they were scolded for their deceptive methods by the sphere beings during a meeting that took place in January 2016. David then shows an image of a solitary crystal in a room, asking Corey what it is. Image of a large crystal in a temperature-controlled room, the inner Earth groups attempting to grow. Corey says when Kari took him into the Hall of Records, there was a large crystal inside a chamber they were apparently trying to regenerate. It was then that he realized why it was so important to Kari's group to have access to his memories of the crystal cave, because they were able to use that information to help them in their efforts with this crystal. The Mayan breakaway civilization. David then introduces the Mayan breakaway civilization, showing an image of three beings, of Central American descent, with mitre hats on, traditional hats often worn by Roman pontiffs. Styled mitre hats worn by Mayan breakaway civilization. David says this group started out as the Mayans, developing so much so that they were eventually able to leave the Earth, forming a breakaway civilization. David adds that this group is actually helping to heal the trauma of people working in the SSP. Corey says that is true, and that they helped him heal from his experiences.